Helen Clark was New Zealand's Prime Minister between 1999 and 2008. She was a popular politician in his country, but in 2009 she decided to go further and accepted an appointment as administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, an organization we know here in Spanish as PNUD. Since then, she has been part of the United Nations system, and now she's looking for the top position. She's one of the 8 candidates to substitute Ban Ki-moon as UN Secretary General. But a challenge to be the top diplomat in the world. In case she succeeds, Helen Clark, now 66-year-old, would be the first woman to hold this job, in a very special moment for the United Nations, which is trying to implement a reform and has to deal with many humanitarian crises at the same time. Who is Helen Clark? Which are her goals as a diplomat, as a woman in politics, as a politician trying to rule the United Nations? Well, let's talk with her in the coming minutes here in Perspectiva. Welcome, Mrs. Clark.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in our radio studio. Mrs. Clark, after 9 years as New Zealand Prime Minister and 7 years as Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, why do you want now to be the next UN Secretary General?
The world faces a lot of challenges, and the United Nations is expected to step up in dealing with those challenges. I think it's a time for someone with proven leadership ability. I've got a lot of that in my own country and region, and of course these last 7 years at the United Nations, heading the development arm of the United Nations. So I'm coming forward because I think I'm the best person for the job. I have the skills for it. I have some very clear ideas on where I think we need to be focusing, and I've got a lot of energy to put into this position.
What would you do different in the UN compared with your predecessors?
I think where we need to be focusing is on the broader issues of peace and stability in the context of development. I'm coming out of a development perspective these past 7 years. We have a wonderful new global development agenda, Agenda 2030. One of its key goals is the building of peaceful and inclusive societies which are based on the rule of law and representative and inclusive institutions. If we could get that right, if we could achieve the eradication of poverty, if we could significantly reduce the inequalities and marginalisation in our world today, I would hope we would never have to deploy peacekeepers again, because peacekeepers are almost an admission that things have gone very, very badly wrong. So we need broader perspectives on peace and development. The conflicts that our world is seeing now are not the conflicts that we saw in World War II or World War I. These are largely civil wars. They have many non-state actors. We have jihadists, we have transnational terrorists with all kinds of motivations. We need new tools to address who is being recruited to these, looking at the drivers of the conflicts and taking broader approaches to peace and security.
Mm-hmm. One of the most important aspects of this selection process seems to be the renewal of the UN. But in your case, after 7 years at the UNDP, you are part of that system. It is possible to think about you as a reformer?
Well, definitely, because of what I've done at UNDP. And the Secretary General's role is to lead the UN organisation and secretariat. I lead the UNDP, which is an autonomous fund and program with a board made up of member states, but not directly under the governance of the General Assembly. So with this set up in UNDP, I have been able to do a lot of reforms. I have been able to decrease the amount spent on management so we can increase the proportion spent on our programming and activities, which is very important. I have led a move to take our staff footprint in New York down so we can put more staff and resource out in the regions of the world, close to the countries where we are seeking to help. So I have a record as a reformer. One of the most important things I think I've achieved is bringing transparency to UNDP. UNDP was like any classic old-fashioned UN organisation, very inwardly focused, guarding its information. We turned that inside out to be transparent, and the last 2 years in a row, we have been judged to be the most transparent aid organisation in the world, better than USAID, better than UK DFID, better than any other aid organisation in the world. So I want to take the kind of approach that I've had as Kiwi Prime Minister, as UNDP Administrator, across First Avenue to the Secretariat, to breathe some new life there.
Mrs. Clark, while you were Prime Minister and now as leader of the UNDP, you proved yourself as a tough administrator. And that precisely has to see with one of the issues United Nations will have to face: finances. So, do you believe that's an asset for your candidacy and that might bring United States support to it? It is important. Washington is actually the main financial supporter for the UN.
United States is the biggest contributor to the UN core budget and to the peacekeeping budget. So there are other obviously very big contributors: Japan, Germany, France, United Kingdom, right up there at the top of the list. I think the key thing before ever asking for more money is look at how you're spending the money you've got. Are you getting the best value for the money? So that's always one of the sets of eyes I bring to things. Are we spending as wisely as we should? But overall, I think this is a job that is now, really crying out for leadership. As I said, the world is in a mess. People look to the UN to be at the vanguard of seeking solutions, whether it's to intractable conflicts, whether it's to taking the world forward to avert the worst consequences of climate change, whether it's the eradication of extreme poverty. UN's got to be on the front foot, and it has to be a voice for the voiceless, and also the place which safeguards the rights of the small states, like the New Zealands and the Uruguays. We depend more than anybody on the international rule of law, on treaties and conventions being upheld. This is an incredibly important role of the UN.
But what do you say about United States support for your candidature?
Well, look, none of the P5, the permanent 5-member countries, will say to you right now who they are supporting. All play their cards close to their chest. But as someone who has been around in top leadership positions in my own country and at the UN for many years, obviously I am extremely well known. I sat with United States and Chinese presidents at the APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Council summits for 8 consecutive years of my 9 years as Prime Minister. I am well known across the P5 countries. So what I say about me, as I would say about New Zealand as a brand, we are direct, we are transparent. Not everyone may agree with everything I or my country have said on every occasion, but they know what they're getting. We are a very known, upfront, transparent quality.
You come from the New Zealand Labour Party.
Correct.
Do you consider that is an important aspect of your profile as candidate in the race for UN Secretary General?
Well, in my work at the UN, obviously I have put domestic politics behind me, so I operate as a top international civil servant, working with people of every political creed and culture. But I think what's very significant about my candidacy is that it is being championed by the New Zealand government from the Prime Minister down. This is the Prime Minister who defeated me in a general election. So I think what that shows is I have the ability to have a rapport across the political spectrum and to earn respect across the political spectrum.
Mrs. Clark, in your vision statement, you ask for an organization that anticipates and responds to the world. What does that mean?
Well, if you look at many of the world's crises today, they didn't come out of nowhere. They often came out of deep underlying development deficits in society. Now, the UN has an incredible presence around the world. Here we are in Uruguay, which is quite a high-income
Yes.
developing country. We are here because Uruguay still values our presence. Similarly, we are through the wealthy countries of the Gulf, all the way to the poorest countries and most conflict-ridden like Somalia. So we know what's going on. I feel that in anticipating crises and working for this long-term prevention of conflict and upholding human security, people's security, we need to use much more the strengths of our UN country teams in country, the people that I've been leading these last 7 years. So often when there's discussion about peace and security, it occurs when things have gone badly wrong. And the deployment of a peacekeeping force is really an admission that things have gone very, very badly wrong. But I think we could do more building on the knowledge and the networks that we have out there around the world to anticipate and prevent crisis. Now, we have to be supported and resourced to do that, but we have the skills to do it.
But does the Secretary General really have any incidence right now in international issues?
Well, there are some issues when it comes to actually deploying peacekeeping, which can be quite slow. But all the recent reports and reviews of the UN's peacekeeping and peace-building setup are saying put more focus on prevention. Now, one of the things that we do as UNDP is we work very closely with the Department of Political Affairs. Together, we put in quite a lot of countries peace and development advisors, experts who are looking, analysing the trends, giving our resident coordinator for the UN, resident representative UNDP, the best advice about what the trends are. We have our eyes and ears across all our agencies. So if we can support that early warning system with a heads up back to our various headquarters, could some intervention be helpful? A lot of conflict can be headed off, in my opinion. I take, for example, the issue of Lesotho, which got into some difficulties in its political system in the last couple of years. The UN worked proactively and with the regional organisation, the Southern African Development Cooperation, and with the Commonwealth, together with a combined effort to bring Lesotho back onto a constitutional course. That needs to be the kind of model of the way we work.
We can see this answer as criticism about Ban Ki-moon's work?
Look, the Secretary General is a very dedicated man.
I ask you that because sometimes we have the feeling that in Ban Ki-moon work there are many press releases to complain about crisis, but too little action from the top of the UN.
So you will never see me criticising the Secretary General. The current Secretary General visited me in his campaign to be Secretary General, just as I have visited your Foreign Minister today. And New Zealand was an early supporter with me as Prime Minister for that. He also appointed me to my current job. He has a lifetime career as a diplomat. I actually have a lifetime career
but
as a
what's your
politician
opinion
and
about
leader.
Ban Ki-moon administration?
I think absolutely dogged determination on the climate change and sustainable development agenda, and in that longer term agenda lie the seeds of more peace and stability. No one could have worked harder, but I bring a different set of skills. I bring leadership skills formed in the hard grind of partisan politics, but making common cause across very disparate points of view. So it's a different set of skills.
Let me ask you about something you have mentioned. How do you evaluate what the UN agencies have done until now in Syria?
Yes.
I think, for instance, in High Commissioner for Refugees, ACNUR, how we name it in Spanish. What's your evaluation?
My evaluation is that the UN has worked on different levels. On the political side, it began with Kofi Annan as an envoy. He walked away in despair. They then engaged Lakhdar Brahimi, a very, very experienced international civil servant in the toughest spots. He also walked away in despair. We now have the third top diplomat, Staffan de Mistura, former Italian Deputy Foreign Minister, a long time in the UN before that. He is giving it everything he's got. The political track is very, very tough, but he's working at it. What about where I sit as head of the development arm and with the humanitarian agencies like the UN High Commission for Refugees. Firstly, at UNDP, we have said for a number of years, can we please have first focus on the people within Syria? Because most people have not left Syria. There are still 19 million people in Syria hanging on in the hope that things will get better. But we have seen people leaving Syria because their children couldn't get into school. Not because there was war in their neighbourhood, but because everything had broken down. So finally, at the big conference on Syria this year in London, our voices were heard. We now have the international funders prepared to fund the emergency development work which helps Syrians in Syria get a job, start a small business, have the children in school, the water supply on, the health services. So we're doing what we can there. Secondly, we are working very closely with UNHCR in the neighbourhood of Syria, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, to help take the pressure off those countries of hosting extraordinary numbers of refugees and supporting refugees to be able to work, which Turkey has now allowed, so that they can have the dignity of supporting themselves. So we have been very, very active. And I think after 4 to 5 years, the international community finally caught up with what the most effective help to the Syrian people in the neighbourhood could be.
But the refugees crisis is also placed in Europe.
Correct.
And from here, we have the impression that the United Nations has no influence on European governments to give them advices on how to deal with that situation.
Well, the European governments are expected to uphold the international rule of law. We have very clear international conventions on how refugees should be treated. And so constantly you will hear the High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, saying, here's what the expectations are. Now, it is clear that some countries in Europe have carried an extraordinary burden of the refugee crisis, a disproportionate burden, and obviously the standouts are Germany and Sweden. They have continually worked for trying to get more burden sharing within the European Union. It's very, very tough debate in the European Union. I am hopeful that the agreement between the EU and Turkey will hold so that we do not see the huge flows across the dangerous seas between Turkey and the Greek islands this year.
You hope?
I hope. And the summer will be the proof of it. But I think also the greater support within Syria for people, the greater support for the countries in the neighbourhood, the ability for refugees to be able to work and sustain themselves and have their children in school, these will take away a number of the pressures which led people to leave for Europe. People left for Europe spending every last cent they could mobilise because they saw absolutely no hope where they were.
One of your opponents in this race is Antonio Guterres, former Portugal Prime Minister and UN Commissioner for Refugees. He has a great experience dealing with the most important humanitarian crisis we have to face today. Don't you think he's well prepared for the job? Maybe better than you are in this aspect?
He's a very worthy opponent, and he's a very old friend.
You're very diplomat.
We were prime ministers together. I have known him for many, 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 many years, and he's been a very, very good colleague. What I would say is that my experience is much broader of working as a prime minister in a very diverse region, leading a very ethnically and culturally diverse country, and also as head of the UN's development arm, having exposure to the issues and the challenges in a far wider range of countries than the High Commissioner for Refugees has.
Mrs. Clark, if you are elected, you will be the first female UN Secretary General in history. There are campaigns calling for a woman to be appointed for the job. But you have said you see yourself as a gender neutral and that you never sought election as a woman. Why?
So firstly, I haven't used the term that I am a gender neutral candidate. Obviously, I'm a woman and I'm proud of being a woman. But what I have said is that throughout my political life, I have never asked people to vote for me because I'm a woman. I ask people to vote for me because I'm the best person for the job. That has been my consistent position from the time when I first competed for a lowly constituency nomination for my party in New Zealand, and then as a Member of Parliament. I think as a woman I bring many strengths to the job, and of course I would love to see a woman lead the UN, and I'd love it to be me.
I wanted to ask you about it. Do you believe that being a woman represents any difference?
Yes.
At this important post?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Why?
Because in my experience, women are much more attuned to the well-being of the human being and their family. Why do I say that? Because actually women, no matter what position they hold, are more linked in to the well-being of family members and what is impacting on them. I may be the administrator of UNDP and a former Prime Minister. I have a 94-year-old father. I'm leaving his meals stacked up in the freezer every time I go home. I'm looking after care arrangements from thousands of miles away, liaising with my family. I mean, I have sisters with a number of children and now grandchildren. I see things from a woman's point of view, from the interaction with the health system, the education system, the social services, from the elderly to the young. So I look at the women who are on the front lines of some of these dreadful situations that we see around the world, and I'm looking at how do women cope? How can we support these women to cope in these circumstances? How can I support societies to give all their girls a chance to complete their education, not be forced into some kind of early marriage? So I'm very, very motivated from the angle of having been fortunate to be born into a society where it was possible for me to achieve my dreams. But we are not at that point in our world.
Would you mention one plan to promote gender equality?
One plan, keep girls in school. So fundamental, because if you cannot complete your education because your family has married you off early, you are on a course for a life of poverty. What we know is that for every extra year of education a girl has, the greater the chances are that her own children will be healthy and that they will reach a higher level of education. She will also be able to be more economically independent and make her own choices. So girls' education is the starting point.
You are not the only woman candidate. There are other three, including the Bulgarian Irina Bokova, who leads Unesco. Do you agree with the statement that says that you are Washington's favorite and Bokova is Moscow's favorite?
Look, I have no insight into whether that is correct or not. To the best of my knowledge, Washington doesn't have a favorite. If Russia has a favorite, I don't know who it is. But what I know is that I come as a very well-known leadership quantity because of many years in high-profile positions. And I would like to think that on the basis of my track record of leadership, experience, achievement, being pragmatic and results-oriented, and a known quantity who gets things done, that I would be well considered.
This selection process is presented as the most transparent ever. Do you agree?
Yes, that's not to say it's highly transparent, but it is the most transparent so far. So never before have candidates had the opportunity to run openly to the General Assembly. And this is the innovation that last December, the President of the General Assembly and the presidency for the month of the Security Council invited all member states to nominate candidates and made it clear that the nominated candidates would get a hearing at the General Assembly. I decided, in the interests of transparency, that I would come forward publicly in time to be part of those scheduled hearings, because I believe that the General Assembly should be able to see that wide range of candidates that was offering. And that was a transparent process and a transparent decision by me.
Do you believe in the future the choice of the new Secretary General can be done openly in the General Assembly? Or at the end, it will be the Big Five choice? It would always be the Big Five choice.
Well, I think it's more than that. Clearly, the permanent 5 members have a veto. That was given in the Charter in 1945. So in the final analysis, any one of those 5 can say a decisive no to a candidate. But actually, for a candidate's name to go to the General Assembly, it must have the support of a majority of the Security Council. And that's where Uruguay is very much a player this time, because Uruguay, like New Zealand, is one of the elected 10 members.
Mm-hmm. So,
very much hope to be encouraged by Uruguay.
Uruguay is part of the Security Council, as you have said. Do you expect our country to support your choice?
Well, I've obviously come to ask your country to be encouraging of my candidacy. That is all that is required as of now.
You have met Uruguayan officials.
I have. And Uruguay and New Zealand have very strong relationship and very strong bonds. So, I'm encouraged.
Mm-hmm. In this transparent selection process, each candidate had to submit a 2,000-word essay pitching themselves for the role. In this interview, you have mentioned 2 or 3 points of that document, but would you like to mention now another one that you consider is important?
Well, I think really making a success of the new global agendas will always be a very high priority for me. We have the new Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which are as relevant to Uruguay and New Zealand as they are to Somalia and Burkina Faso. It is a universal agenda. Every country needs to own this agenda, take it home, look at what they need to do to be successful by it, and the UN can be extremely supportive of that process. Secondly, the Paris Agreement on climate change is a huge thing. Current Secretary-General has invested enormous energy in that. I can assure you I will put every bit as much energy in, because while the Paris Agreement is a very good agreement, we do not yet have enough commitments from the world's nations to meet the aspirations of the Paris Agreement. So we need more action, more commitment, and that would be my job, to be really driving for that over these next few years.
Let's talk a little bit more about UN reform. Are you open to a reform that could clear the path to new permanent members of the Security Council, like Germany, for instance?
Well, it's a question that was asked at the hearings, and actually it's a question that the Secretary-General has absolutely no influence over. So your views are worth no more than anybody else's. The member states have to focus on this. If you ask me the question, is the Security Council as it is configured today the right configuration? My answer is no, because it was written in 1945 in a charter that you would have these particular 5 permanent members who aside from China, were the victors of World War II. That was before I was born. We now have a new geopolitical, geo-economic reality, and that needs to be reflected in the Security Council. But this has been debated for many years without resolution.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe we will ever see a Security Council with other permanent members?
I don't know. It has been so tough. And the last time it really got to the white heat of a discussion, the member states couldn't close the gap. So I think it's there for perhaps another Secretary-General to service the debate in terms of continuing to say what the options are. But in the end, the member states have to grapple with this. And of course, the configuration of the Security Council is also subject to a veto by any of the 5 permanent members, so it won't be easy to advance.
Where is now the UN reform in terms of progress? Is it moving forward?
On Security Council, there are a number of issues being considered. For example, France has put forward a good proposal, in my view, which is that there should be a voluntary restraint on the use of the veto where there is genocide or very, very serious, examples of atrocities against people. I think this is good. There are some countries advocating what they call an intermediate solution, which would see some of the major emerging powers take more regular seats on the Security Council, but the Security Council would then have to be enlarged because, and I speak from the perspective of small countries like New Zealand and Uruguay, if some larger countries are to be more continuously on the Council, then one wouldn't want that to cut out the voices of the small countries. It's very important that everybody gets a chance. On other issues of UN reform, I mean, Uruguay has been a proponent of reform in the development system. Uruguay was one of the what were called the Delivering as One pilot countries, where the UN country team worked in a much more coordinated way and directly with the government. So that continues to be something we drive forward on.
How bureaucratic do you believe the UN is right now? And how do you want it to become?
Well, when I came to UNDP, the thing that most concerned me was, would it be impossible to get change in quite an old-fashioned bureaucratic organisation? I found it was possible to get change, to drive down management costs, to provide entry for more junior employees, to have fewer managers, to relocate people closer to the countries they served in regional hubs. So I look at the UN Secretariat. I think it is very bureaucratic, but in my experience at UNDP, I'm sure there are things one could do to make it a more modern organisation.
I have 2 or 3 more questions, and we finish. I want to know about how you are following Latin American affairs, some Latin American affairs. Are you following the Brazilian political crisis?
Yes.
And the impeachment process that ousted President Dilma Rousseff?
Yes. I follow affairs in the continent very closely, and I should say, for the record, I have a lifelong interest in Latin America. When I was quite a young political activist, of course, Latin America was going through a very bleak stage with many dictatorships, including in this country. Chile was the oldest relationship New Zealand had in Latin America. The first embassy we opened was in Chile, and the coup d'etat in Chile affected my country very deeply. We took refugees. And our trade union movement kept up a ban on trade with Chile for many years. So I've had a long time interest in the continent. I've visited here a couple of dozen times as a private citizen, as New Zealand Prime Minister, and of course as administrator. I have a lot of familiarity with the region.
And so what do you think about Brazil's political crisis? Do you consider this is a coup d'etat, as Dilma has said many times?
You know, as an international civil servant, I'm not free to offer an opinion on that. I have my private opinions, and of course, I like to support women leaders in principle. You know, I'm familiar with President Dilma Rousseff's background. She's been a fighter all her life, and she will keep fighting for what she believes in. And as a woman, I admire her.
And what about Venezuela? Could the United Nations have had a more active involvement in such a crisis, an economic crisis, and also a humanitarian crisis, since there is a lack of food and medicines right now?
I don't think the UN has seen an entry point for Venezuela. We have an office there. We have a resident representative. We have programming there. But I think the resolution of Venezuela's issues are in the hands of Venezuelans. They've had elections. It's produced a different...
That's not a case for the United Nations to act in order to prevent?
I think Venezuelans have the capacity to sort this.
And the last question. In the case of Uruguay, as you know, the country has been and is involved in many peacekeeping missions around the world. But there are a lot of discussions inside the country, especially among the Frente Amplio, the party in government, about the convenience of continuing those missions. This is a concern to you?
Uruguay makes an incredible contribution to peacekeeping. This small country, I understand, over the life of its contributions, has put more than 44,000 people out into peacekeeping missions. Incredible. Right now it has more than 1,400. They are more than 1,100 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a couple of hundred plus in Haiti and some other small deployments. So this is incredible. I can only say muchas gracias, Uruguay, and UN is very grateful and would hope that Uruguay would keep doing it.
But you didn't answer my question.
I would hope that people would see the incredible contribution and see how much it is valued and keep making it.
Mrs. Helen Clark, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.